Grüezi miteinander, hello. My name is Eve, and on my channel I talk about how to teach your child German when you are not a native German speaker. Today's topic is how I motivate my children, questions to ask yourself, and challenges of not knowing the target language you're trying to teach your child. So a really important question to ask yourself is, why are you learning German? That answer is going to help push you forward when German starts to get tough, or you feel like you're not making any progress, or there's really hard German grammar concepts that you can't really understand. So that's going to propel you forward when you feel like giving up. My family and we are learning German because we are Swiss American. Our goal in the future is to learn Swiss German. So in order to do that, we first are going to learn German, and then eventually we will learn Swiss German. So that's why we are learning German. Another question to ask yourself is, how serious are you about learning German? Is this just a fun hobby? Is this something you're just going to try? For your children, is it mandatory? Is it just like making their beds in the morning? How serious are you about German? So with my boys, German is mandatory. It is mandatory, like doing chores and helping out with putting away the dishes. They have to learn German. That's a decision my husband and I made together, that German was mandatory. When it comes to sports, they can play whatever sports they want. But when it comes to learning German, that is mandatory. So that's a really important question to ask yourself. Another really important question is, what is your definition of fluency? When you say, I want my child to be fluent in German, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that they are able to speak perfectly in German? Does that include reading? And does that include writing? Some people's definition of fluency is different than others. Some people think that fluency is being able to read, write, and speak in a language. But what's your definition? If you only want your children to be able to speak in German and not read or write in it, then you will go down a different path than someone that wants to do all three. You have to do what's right for your family. But that's really important to know, because if let's say you hire a tutor and they start writing and teaching them how to read, and you're like, I just want them to focus on speaking, that's really important for you to figure out what you want your children to learn. Now I'm going to talk about how I motivate my children to learn German. So 9 out of 10 times, my boys want to play their iPad. And if they want to play their iPad or watch TV, they have to give me German. So it's a form of payment in my house. I'm like, oh, you want to watch TV or you want to play games on your iPad? Well, you have to do German for me. That's usually motivation enough for them to do it. I usually don't have a problem. So once I say, okay, after this, you can have your iPad, then they do what they have to do. Sometimes, if they had a bad day and they don't really feel like talking, I got this tip toy pen for them. And I got this off eBay. And this actually came from England. And it's actually cheaper to get the pen and the book as a set rather than buying the pen and the book separately. It's not cheap, but it is really fun and interactive. And when my kids, don't feel like talking that day, they simply press the pictures of this book.
Willkommen im Buch. Hallo, ich erkläre dir, was du mit diesem Buch alles machen und erleben kannst. Also, los geht's. Unten rechts auf der Seite siehst du verschiedene Zeichen.
So what's great about this pen is that they just tap all the pictures and German is spoken to them. So they're listening to the German, which is really important. And it's interactive, they're pressing on the pictures. And there's also games you can do in this book. So that's what I do to motivate them on days they just don't feel like talking very much. If they have an issue with reading that day, like they don't like the book I'm choosing, You know, I say, well, how about we read a comic book in German? So, you know, there's Calvin and Hobbes in German. There are Garfield books in German. So I'll do that, you know, make the reading fun instead of like handing them a book and saying, you read this to me, you know. Then I make them read to me and translate. And that usually is enough for them to do their German homework for the day. And another thing I do is I bribe them. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Sometimes I'm like, if they are really just not wanting to do German that day, I'm like, listen, you do German, I'll give you 3 jelly beans. And then usually that works. Or I'll give them a popsicle, you know. Some days are really easy and then some days are really hard. So I'm like, well, how can I get my child to learn German that day, you know? So I do what I gotta do. And I don't know if that's like the greatest advice ever, but it works. So sometimes I'll give them like a little piece of candy or something along those lines. But, you know, I just want to make sure they're getting German every day. And if I have to buy them every so often to do it, that's what I'm going to do. Food always works for my boys. I don't know. Let me know what motivates your children. Or if you have any ideas how to motivate your children to learn German, I would love to hear it. So you can write a comment below. And I just want to mention that my oldest son, I don't have to bribe him as much as my youngest son. Over the years, he has learned, you know, he just knows he has to do German. So he doesn't fight me as much as my youngest son does. But, you know, my son was in school and they were reading a book. I believe it's called Mac B. And it had German in this book. And the teacher was struggling to read the German. So she asked, does anyone know German? And my son raised his hand and he ran up and he started helping her read the German. And then after class, there is another Swiss girl in his class, and she said to him, I think it's really cool. You know how to read in German. That's really cool. And it made my son feel so proud. I tell you, I didn't need to bribe him at all for the past couple of weeks, just because he's so proud of himself. Because he's like, hey, German came in handy. Like, I actually used this, and he felt so good about himself. So, you know, my youngest one's a little more stubborn. I think, you know, he's the baby. Now I'm going to talk about the challenges of not being fluent in a language I'm trying to teach to my children. So it gets a bit frustrating for me when my children are asking me what a word is in German or how do I say this in German, and I constantly have to get out my phone because I don't know. Sometimes I get confused between the genders of the word. I'm like, is it der? Is it das? Is it die? I don't know. I don't remember. So I constantly have to look it up. There are sometimes I'm like trying to think of a sentence. If they ask me, you know, how to say this in German, I'm trying to think of the sentence. And then I'm constantly in my head thinking, well, is this in accusative? Is this in dative? You know, some verbs like are in dative. Some words are in accusative. So it gets really confusing and I'm really in my head a lot, like, and then I won't tell them what the sentence is unless I look it up. Sometimes I get self-conscious about speaking to them in German because then I get a little scared, like, what if I'm teaching them bad habits? What if it's wrong? But eventually, you know, I'm like, you know what? I have to embrace making mistakes because that's the only way we are going to learn anything. If I never speak to my children, if I never try to speak in German, I'm never going to be fluent in German. So I would say to you, embrace the mistakes. Just speak as much as you can. And it's okay if it's wrong. When you first started learning your first language, I'm sure you made a ton of mistakes. Don't be embarrassed by it. Just embrace it. Embrace those mistakes and then look it up and then figure out how to say it properly and then say it. It's not a big deal. And you know what? A lot of my German teachers always say to me, you know, Eve, if you get the die, das, der wrong or use the accusative instead of dative, we're going to understand what you're saying anyway. We know what you mean. So, you know, don't beat yourself up over it, you know. So I always remind myself, like, if I make little mistakes, it's okay, you know. German isn't my first language. And I think if I'm talking to someone in German, they're going to know it's definitely not my first language. And maybe they're going to be like way more forgiving with my grammar mistakes. And so I just say, just try to speak it as much as you can. Don't worry about the mistakes. You'll get better. So don't give up. So I hope you enjoyed this talk today. I hope it was helpful. Please subscribe to my channel and please give me a like if you like this video. So thank you so much for your time. Dankeschön. Tschüss.